I almost didn't go. When the invitation arrived, thick cream cardstock with gold leaf edging and Lily's name embossed in looping script, I stared at it longer than I'd ever stared at deployment orders. My younger sister was hosting her baby shower in Carmel Heights, the kind of gated neighborhood outside Charlotte where the lawns are trimmed with surgical precision and the houses all look like they were designed to impress drones flying overhead. Lily Harper Collins, 33, married to Dr. Ethan Collins, a cardiologist with a jawline as structured as his resume, pregnant with their first child and glowing in every photo my mother forwarded to me like proof of a life well lived. I am 37 years old, a former Marine Corps captain with 12 years of service and 2 overseas deployments, and somehow in my family's narrative I am still the one figuring things out. I transitioned into private security consulting after I left active duty, built a client list in Charlotte from scratch, pay my mortgage on time, and still somehow get spoken about like I'm in a prolonged gap year. Lily, on the other hand, has always been the golden child. Soft-spoken, photogenic, effortlessly likable. The kind of daughter my mother, Patricia Harper, can introduce at church with a hand pressed proudly to her chest. The night before the shower, my phone lit up with a text from Mom. She didn't bother with small talk. She wrote that she knew I was proud of my service, but maybe I shouldn't wear my marine dress blues tomorrow because this day is about Lily and we don't want to distract from her moment. I read it 3 times, each time feeling the same familiar tightening in my chest, the same subtle suggestion that my existence in full color might overshadow someone else's pastel. For a few minutes I actually considered it. I pulled a neutral sundress from the back of my closet, something beige and forgettable, the kind of dress that blends into linen tablecloths. I held it up in front of the mirror and tried to imagine walking into Carmel Heights looking smaller than I am, softer than I am, less decorated than I have earned the right to be. I imagined the polite smiles, the sideways glances, the inevitable introduction. This is Madison, she was in the military, she's between things right now. Instead, I unzipped the garment bag hanging beside it. My Marine Corps dress blues were exactly where I left them, pressed, structured, unapologetic. I ran my fingers over the fabric, over the ribbons and medals I had polished myself the night before, each one representing time away from home, sand in my boots, decisions that carried weight. Wearing that uniform has never been about attention. It has always been about acknowledgement. About standing in the truth of what I have done. I slept badly that night not because I doubted my choice but because I knew what it meant. Choosing the uniform wasn't about stealing Lily's spotlight. It was about refusing to dim myself to make her glow feel brighter. I am tired of being framed as the family disappointment simply because my life does not fit neatly into bridal registries and ultrasound photos. The morning of the shower I dressed slowly, deliberately. Every button fastened with steady hands, every medal aligned with precision. When I looked in the mirror, I saw the woman I had built through discipline and sacrifice, not the caricature my family sometimes paints. My posture straightened automatically, shoulders back, chin level, the kind of bearing that 12 years in the Corps etches into your bones. Driving through the gates of Carmel Heights, past manicured hedges and imported stone fountains, I felt the tension settle into something colder and clearer. I already expected the subtle humiliation, the backhanded compliments, the comparisons disguised as concern. But this time I wasn't walking in prepared to apologize for who I am. If my presence in my own earned uniform made anyone uncomfortable, that discomfort was not mine to carry. Carmel Heights looked exactly the way I expected it to, like a catalog spread for curated suburban perfection. And as I pulled up to Lily's house I could already see the white event tent rising above the manicured hedges like a temporary palace erected to celebrate the inevitable continuation of a very specific kind of life. The driveway was lined with luxury SUVs, and beyond them pastel balloons framed the entrance to the backyard where a monogrammed wooden sign reading "Welcome Baby Collins" stood propped on an easel, delicate script curling around painted florals that probably cost more than my first car. The moment I stepped out, the late morning sun hit the dark blue of my dress uniform and I felt the fabric settle across my shoulders like armor. Conversations under the tent dipped almost imperceptibly at first, then fractured completely as heels shifted on stone and heads turned in unison. I walked across the lawn with measured steps, every movement controlled, aware of the metals catching the light, aware of the whispers that followed me in soft, astonished ripples. The decor was aggressively gentle, blush tablecloths, ivory roses, crystal pitchers of orange juice beside a champagne fountain that burbled cheerfully as if nothing in the world could possibly be tense beneath a canopy of chiffon. My mother reached me before anyone else could. Patricia Harper was dressed in pale blue silk, perfectly coordinated with the theme, and her smile stretched too wide the second her eyes took in the uniform. She kissed the air beside my cheek and then leaned back just enough to look me over. "Madison," she said lightly, her tone sugar-coated but tight, "I didn't realize you'd actually wear that in this heat. You must be roasting," and I could hear the unspoken addition that I had made myself impossible to ignore. I told her I was fine, that I was used to worse climates than a North Carolina spring, and she gave a short laugh that did not reach her eyes before glancing around to gauge who was watching. Lily made her entrance a few minutes later, emerging from the house like the final reveal in a lifestyle commercial. She wore a flowing maternity dress in soft pink that clung just enough to highlight her rounded belly, her hair styled in loose waves that framed a face glowing with careful makeup and uncomplicated joy. When she spotted me, her eyebrows lifted, and she crossed the lawn with one hand resting theatrically on her stomach. "You actually came," she announced loudly enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear, her voice bright but edged with something that suggested my attendance had been a gamble she was prepared to lose. I hugged her carefully, conscious of the metals pressing between us, and told her of course I came. She pulled back and looked me up and down with an exaggerated sweep of her gaze. "Wow," she said, "you really know how to make an entrance, don't you, Maddie?" And a few women nearby laughed politely as if she had delivered a harmless joke instead of a reminder that I was once again the outlier in a carefully choreographed scene. The brunch was immaculate, catered platters of smoked salmon, miniature quiches, fruit arranged like edible art, and servers circulating with trays of mimosas that caught the sunlight in sparkling flutes. I declined the champagne and poured myself a glass of orange juice instead, aware that drinking in uniform was out of the question and also aware that the choice marked me as further removed from the easy indulgence around me. Conversations flowed effortlessly from one table to another, discussions about nursery color palettes, the best pediatricians in Charlotte, waiting lists for private preschools that apparently required strategic planning before a child could even sit up unassisted. I stood at the edge of these circles, nodding when someone made eye contact, offering a brief smile before their attention drifted back to safer, softer topics. When introduced, I was framed with a familiar script. "This is Madison, Lily's older sister. She was in the Marines. She does security consulting now. Always so independent." The word independent landed differently here, less like a compliment and more like a euphemism for alone. As I watched Lily move from group to group, hands reaching to touch her belly, faces lighting up with uncomplicated admiration, I felt two opposing currents inside me. One was pride, steady and immovable in everything my uniform represented, in the discipline and sacrifice and leadership that had shaped me. The other was the quiet, persistent chill of dismissal, the sense that in this pastel world my service was a curiosity at best and a disruption at worst. I was not here as Madison the captain or Madison the consultant, but as a prop in Lily's story, the independent older sister who never quite settled down, standing tall and alone beneath a white tent built to celebrate a life that fit far more comfortably within its delicate walls. It happened when the room had settled into that complacent hum people get after they've eaten and had enough champagne to feel bold but not enough to be sloppy, when the laughter comes easy and the cruelty can be packaged as a joke. Lily was standing near the center of the tent with a flute in hand, cheeks flushed, surrounded by a semicircle of women who looked like they all used the same esthetician. Someone had just finished telling a story about her husband crying at the first ultrasound, and Lily laughed with practiced sweetness, her hand drifting to her belly as if she needed to remind everyone why they were here. Then her eyes landed on me and I felt the air change, subtle at first, like a draft slipping under a door. She tilted her head and smiled in my direction, the kind of smile that reads warm until you hear what follows. "Okay," she said loudly, clinking her glass with her nail for attention, "I have a fun one. Guess who's still single after all these years?" She let the pause hang just long enough for the crowd to understand who she meant without having to say my name, and the sound that followed was polite laughter, the social kind people use when they don't want to look humorless in front of the host. A few faces turned toward me with sympathetic half-smiles, like I was a stray dog that had wandered into a garden party. Before I could even decide whether to move or speak, my mother stepped in as if this were her cue. Patricia's expression was bright, almost proud, and she lifted her chin the way she always did when she thought she was offering wisdom. Not everyone chooses the right path, she said, her tone light but pointed, but Lily certainly did. Another wave of laughter came, slightly louder this time, and I watched several guests nod as if they had just heard something profound rather than something sharp. I felt heat climb my neck, not from embarrassment but from anger, from the familiar sting of being reduced to a lesson in what not to become. For a fraction of a second I imagined what they expected, a forced laugh, a self-deprecating comment, maybe a quick excuse about being married to my job. That is the role I've played at holidays and birthdays, the one that keeps the peace by making me smaller. I could feel the old reflex trying to pull me into it. Instead I did what 12 years of training had taught me to do when someone tried to provoke a reaction. I kept my face neutral. I kept my shoulders squared. I let my silence be deliberate, not stunned. I took a slow sip of orange juice, set the glass down with care, and held my posture as if I were standing inspection. The laughter petered out unevenly, and I could sense people recalibrating when I didn't give them the easy punchline. Inside something shifted. It was not a dramatic surge or a sudden speech forming on my tongue. It was a quiet click like a lock turning. I realized that if I left early, if I retreated to my car and drove home with my hands gripping the steering wheel, it would become part of the story they told later. Madison got upset. Madison couldn't take a joke. Madison stormed off, still so intense. I had heard versions of that narrative since I was a teenager and I was tired of feeding it. So I decided I was staying. Not to prove anything to them, not to endure punishment, but because I refused to be chased out of a space I had been invited into, even if the invitation came with conditions. I would not shrink and I would not flee. As I stood there, memories flickered through me with an unwanted clarity. Lily at 16, prom queen, my mother crying and calling her radiant while I waited in the hallway in a thrift store dress, already labeled the serious one. Lily winning a scholarship, cameras flashing as Patricia hugged her and told everyone she was destined for greatness, while my acceptance into the Marines was met with tight-lipped concern and the comment that I was too intense and needed to learn how to soften. Lily's engagement party, where I was asked to take pictures because I was good at organizing things, as if leadership only counted when it served her. I looked around the tent again at the pastel perfection, the crystal glasses, the curated celebration, and I understood with an odd calm that I had been cast as a contrast for Lily my entire life. She was the example, I was the caution. She was the path, I was the detour. Standing in my uniform, I felt the weight of every medal and every mile, and I decided that this would be the last time my family got to make me the joke that bonded everyone else together. I didn't need to fight them out loud to change that. I just needed to stop cooperating with it. I stepped away from the tent before the gift opening started, needing air that wasn't perfumed with peonies and condescension, and followed a stone path that curved around the back of the property into a garden trimmed so precisely it barely looked real. The noise of the party dulled behind me, replaced by the quieter sounds of water trickling from a decorative fountain and the distant hum of conversation carried on the breeze. I kept my posture straight even out there as if someone might still be grading me, but I finally let my jaw unclench. That was when I heard a small voice behind me ask with complete seriousness, "Are you sad?" I turned to see a boy standing a few feet away, maybe 8 years old, dark hair neatly combed, wearing a miniature blazer that made him look like he had been dressed by a marketing team. His eyes were steady in a way adults rarely manage. Beside him stood a man I recognized immediately by bearing alone before I even registered the insignia pin on his lapel. He carried himself like someone who understood command without needing to announce it. I gave the boy a small, honest smile. "No," I said evenly, "I'm not sad." He studied me for another second as if evaluating the answer for accuracy. "You look like you're trying not to be," he replied, blunt in the way only children can be. The man beside him exhaled a quiet laugh and rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said, extending his other hand toward me. "Daniel Brooks. Recently reassigned." The handshake was firm, precise, and when his eyes dropped briefly to my chest, they didn't linger in curiosity but sharpened in recognition. "Captain," he said, not as a question but as acknowledgement, and there was no trace of irony in it. His gaze flicked over my ribbons with practiced efficiency. "2 deployments overseas. You've had a career." "Former captain," I corrected automatically, but the word former felt lighter than it had in months. "Colonel," he replied simply, and there was something grounding about the exchange, the mutual understanding that didn't require explanation or apology. He didn't ask what I was doing here as if I had wandered into the wrong venue. He didn't frame my service as a colorful backstory. He treated it as fact. Noah tugged slightly at his father's sleeve. Dad says medals mean you did something brave, he informed me. Did you? Sometimes brave, sometimes necessary, I answered, and Daniel's mouth curved faintly at that. We spoke for several minutes, the conversation easy in a way nothing inside the tent had been. He mentioned he had just been reassigned to a base near Charlotte and was still getting settled. When I asked how he knew Lily and Ethan, a subtle shift passed across his expression. Lily did a short Navy medical rotation years ago at a base I commanded, he said. It was brief. There was weight in the way he said brief, not unkind, just measured. I didn't press, but I filed it away. When we finally walked back toward the tent together, Noah moving ahead of us with the distracted confidence of a child who feels safe, I could feel the energy change before we even stepped fully inside. Conversations slowed again, but this time the attention wasn't fixed solely on me. Daniel's presence carried its own gravity, and when Lily spotted us approaching side by side, her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. Colonel Brooks, she said, her tone bright but tighter than before, I didn't realize you'd made it. I'm glad I did, he replied evenly, his hand resting lightly at Noah's shoulder. I'm actually here because of Madison. The words landed cleanly without flourish, but they moved through the crowd like a current. I saw my mother's posture stiffen, saw guests glance between us recalculating whatever assumptions they had settled on earlier. Daniel did not elaborate, did not wink or joke. He simply stood beside me, close enough that the alignment felt intentional. For the first time since I had arrived, I was not an isolated figure in dress blues at the edge of someone else's celebration. I was standing next to someone who recognized exactly what those blues meant, and who had chosen without hesitation to make that recognition visible. The subtle hierarchy that had placed me at the margins shifted almost imperceptibly, and in that shift I felt something unfamiliar in this setting, not defiance, not even vindication, but balance. I was no longer the family punchline suspended in pastel air. I was a decorated officer being addressed as such, and I was not alone in the room anymore. Once Daniel had anchored himself beside me, the party's temperature changed, and I watched Lily work twice as hard to keep control of the room without looking like she was doing it. She drifted from table to table with that practiced hostess energy, laughing a little too loudly, touching her belly a little too often, as if constant motion could smooth over any disturbance. I stayed near the edge of the tent with my orange juice and listened more than I spoke, because I had learned a long time ago that people reveal the truth when they think you are background noise. I heard Lily's voice before I saw her, light and airy as she addressed a cluster of women near the dessert stand. Someone had asked how she knew Colonel Brooks, and Lily waved a dismissive hand as if brushing away lint. Oh, she said, we barely worked together. It was just a short rotation. You know how those things are. Her laugh followed, quick and bright, and a couple of women nodded as if that settled it. The way she said barely was too deliberate, like she was placing a lid on something that had steam under it. A few minutes later, Daniel stepped away with Noah to look at the fountain, and when he returned he paused near me again, glancing around the tent with the same calm assessment I'd seen in people who spend their lives reading rooms for threat and intent. I kept my voice low and casual when I asked, so you and Lily really barely crossed paths? Daniel's expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, a slight tightening at the corner of his mouth, and then he exhaled like someone deciding to tell the truth without making a production of it. We worked together more than she's implying, he said, tone even. She was assigned under my command structure during that period. We spent a fair amount of time in the same circles. His eyes flicked toward Lily across the tent, then back to me. People like to rewrite old chapters when the current story is prettier. He didn't say anything explicitly inappropriate, and he didn't need to. The careful neutrality in his phrasing felt like restraint, not uncertainty. It made Lily's breezy dismissal feel less like forgetfulness and more like strategy. I could have let it go. A normal sister might have let it go, might have decided that whatever Lily had done years ago was none of my business, not my problem, not my fight. But standing there in my uniform, having just been publicly mocked for my life choices, I felt something inside me settle into a colder clarity. Lily had spent years polishing her image until it shone so brightly that any flaw in it would look like sabotage. If she had blurred lines while she was building the life my mother worshipped, it mattered not because I wanted revenge, but because I was tired of being measured against a standard that might have been fake. I waited until I was out of direct view, angled my body as if I were checking an email, and pulled my phone from my clutch. My fingers moved with a steady calm that surprised me. Lily was the kind of person who documented everything. Engagement announcement posts, smiling couple photos, captions about destiny and forever. If there was a crack, it would be buried in plain sight. I scrolled back through her profile to the year of that rotation, watching dates blur by in a parade of beach weekends and brunches and polished selfies. Then I found it. A photo album from her overseas stint, posted with a caption about serving and learning and the incredible leadership she'd been lucky to witness. In the third photo, there she was in uniform, not full dress, but still unmistakably military, standing close to Daniel in a way that wasn't formal. His arm wasn't around her waist, but it was near enough, his hand resting at the small of her back like it belonged there. Lily's head was tilted toward him, smile softer than the one she used for family pictures, and the space between them looked intimate, not incidental. They looked comfortable together, not like strangers who barely worked together, but like two people who had shared moments that didn't make it into the official story. My stomach tightened as I checked the date stamp. That was the same month Lily had posted the public engagement announcement with Ethan. The glossy picture of her hand held up to the camera, ring catching the light, caption full of gratitude and excitement and certainty. I stared at the screen and felt the timeline click into place with a quiet, ugly precision. I slid my phone back into my clutch and lifted my gaze to Lily across the tent, laughing as she accepted another gift, surrounded by women who adored her certainty. My reaction surprised me. I didn't feel the hot rush of anger I'd expected, or the urge to confront her in the middle of her baby shower. What I felt was something quieter, more controlled, the same mindset I used when I noticed an inconsistency in a report or a detail that didn't match the narrative someone was pushing. If Lily had been willing to bend boundaries while she was building the life everyone praised, then maybe the gap between us wasn't my failure at all. Maybe it was her story that had cracks in it, and for the first time that day my motivation shifted. I wasn't defending myself anymore. I was simply seeing her clearly. Lily found me near the edge of the tent just as the gift opening wrapped up and the guests began drifting toward coffee and tiny frosted cupcakes. And the way she approached me was deliberate, her smile fixed in place for anyone watching, but her eyes sharpened into something far less friendly the second we were close enough to speak without being overheard. She touched my arm lightly, nails perfectly manicured, and said in a voice sweet enough to rot enamel that she hoped I was enjoying myself since I so rarely got to be the center of attention. I met her gaze evenly and told her I was simply attending her baby shower. Nothing more, nothing less. She let out a soft laugh that didn't match the tension in her jaw and leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough to keep the illusion of sisterly intimacy. "You really showed up in full uniform," she said, "like you wanted to remind everyone you exist. I didn't think you'd enjoy the spotlight this much." The comment was polished, almost playful, but it carried the same old implication that any space I occupied in full form was somehow an intrusion. I kept my shoulders squared and my expression neutral, refusing to give her the satisfaction of visible irritation. "People are looking at me," I said calmly. "It might be because this uniform means something." Her lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "Or maybe it's because it's dramatic," she countered. "Some of us don't need medals to feel important." There it was again, the quiet slicing comparison wrapped in silk. Before I could respond, she shifted tactics, her tone softening into something that might have sounded concerned to anyone else. "And just so you don't get the wrong idea," she added, "don't mistake kindness for interest. Men like him are just polite to women like you. Women like you." The phrase hung between us heavier than anything she had said earlier in front of the crowd. I understood exactly what she meant without her having to elaborate. Independent, intense, unattached. The type men respect in theory but supposedly do not choose in practice. For a split second I felt the old reflex to defend myself, to insist I wasn't chasing anyone, that I didn't need validation from a colonel or anyone else. Instead, I tilted my head slightly and let my voice drop to the same measured register she was using. "It's interesting," I said, "that you told everyone you barely worked with him. Because he remembers it differently." The change in her face was subtle but unmistakable. Her eyes flickered, not wide enough to draw attention, but enough that I saw calculation replace confidence. I continued before she could regroup. "You called it a short rotation," I said evenly. "He described it as spending a fair amount of time under his command structure. Those don't sound like the same story." For a heartbeat her composure slipped, and I saw something raw beneath it, Not guilt exactly, but alarm at losing control of the framing. She recovered quickly, drawing herself up and smoothing a hand over her dress as if she could press the moment flat. "You're reading too much into it," she replied, the sweetness returning but thinner now. "It was years ago. You wouldn't understand how these things work in medical rotations." I held her gaze and let the silence stretch just enough to be uncomfortable. "I understand timelines," I said quietly. "And I remember when you announced your engagement. That was the closest I came to saying it outright, and it was enough." Her breath hitched, barely noticeable, but I saw the muscles in her neck tense. For the first time all afternoon, she wasn't speaking from a position of effortless superiority. She was calculating risk. "You're unbelievable," she whispered, the edge finally breaking through the sugar. "This is my baby shower." "I know," I answered, and my tone stayed calm, almost gentle. "That's why I'm not saying any of this out loud." We stood there facing each other, years of rivalry compressed into a space no wider than the gap between our shoes. I thought about every time I had been labeled too intense, too much, too unwilling to play along, and I realized that Lily's advantage had never been kindness or perfection. It had been narrative control. She curated her life the way she curated this party. Soft colors, flattering angles, inconvenient details edited out before anyone else could notice them. In that moment I understood something with absolute clarity. Her power didn't come from being better than me. It came from everyone believing the story she told first. And for the first time she knew I had seen behind it. By the time the last of the pastel gift bags had been loaded into SUVs and the hired staff began quietly dismantling the dessert table, the energy of the afternoon had thinned into something more intimate and far less performative. The white tent remained lit from within by soft amber bulbs, but most of the neighborhood spectacle had dissolved, leaving only immediate family and the kind of guests who were either too important or too entangled to be dismissed with polite hugs. A smaller dinner had been arranged outdoors behind the house, a long wooden table set beneath string lights that cast everything in a flattering golden haze, as if even the truth would look softer there. It was just the six of us now, Patricia at one end of the table like a queen presiding over fragile peace, Lily and Ethan side by side with her hand resting possessively over his, Daniel across from them with Noah next to him swinging his legs under the chair, and me seated diagonally where I could see everyone without turning my head. The catered brunch had given way to plated salmon and roasted vegetables, wine glasses catching the light while a mild Carolina evening settled around us. The conversation stayed carefully neutral at first, centered on Noah's adjustment to the move and Ethan's latest success at the hospital, the kind of topics that require admiration but not scrutiny. Daniel spoke with easy confidence about the reassignment, mentioning that leaving California had been an adjustment after years stationed at Camp Pendleton. The name hung in the air with weight, and I noticed Lily's fingers tighten slightly around her fork before she forced a smile. "Camp Pendleton was beautiful," she said lightly, as if commenting on a vacation destination rather than a posting. "I learned a lot there." Daniel nodded once, his expression unreadable in the warm light. "It was a demanding command," he replied evenly, "but a formative one." I let the conversation flow for another minute before I set my glass down and spoke in the same casual tone I would use to ask about the weather. "Lily," I said, "when exactly was your rotation there?" "I remember it overlapping with some big announcements." Her eyes flicked to mine, and for a second the only sound was the faint clink of cutlery against porcelain. "It was years ago," she answered quickly. "Just a short assignment before Ethan and I really settled into things." Ethan turned his head slightly toward her, brows knitting in mild confusion rather than suspicion. "That was right before we got engaged, wasn't it?" he asked, his voice thoughtful rather than accusatory. "I thought you were already back when we did the announcement dinner with our parents." Patricia shifted in her seat so abruptly that her wine glass rattled. The string lights above us swayed slightly in the evening breeze, casting moving shadows across her face that could not disguise the tension gathering there. "Of course she was back," Patricia interjected with a tight laugh. "The timeline isn't that important. It was such a whirlwind." I kept my expression composed, my posture straight even though we were no longer under the scrutiny of a crowd. "I'm only asking because Daniel mentioned how involved the rotation was," I said calmly. It sounded more substantial than brief. Daniel did not look at me when I spoke, but he did not contradict me either. He simply continued cutting his food with measured precision, allowing the silence to expand in a way that felt deliberate. Noah glanced between the adults with open curiosity, sensing the shift without understanding it. Lily's composure held, but only just. It was substantial professionally, she clarified, each word chosen carefully. Not personally. And the engagement timeline was exactly as Ethan remembers. Ethan looked between us again, slower this time, the easy certainty he had carried all afternoon no longer quite as solid. I just remember you flying back and forth a lot, he said. It felt like we were planning everything long distance. Patricia cleared her throat sharply and reached for the wine bottle as if refilling glasses could drown the direction the conversation was drifting. What matters, she said pointedly, is that Lily and Ethan built a beautiful life together. I nodded once, not arguing, not pressing further, but I allowed the implication to sit there untouched. Under the string lights, surrounded by manicured hedges and curated elegance, the narrative felt less seamless than it had beneath the tent. No accusations had been made, no secrets declared, yet the air carried a subtle fracture. For the first time that evening I was not the one being examined. I was simply the one who had asked a question. The air at the table had already thinned when Daniel finally looked up from his plate. Not at me but at Lily, his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested he was searching his memory rather than making an accusation. I remember a photo on your desk, he said casually, as if recalling office decor instead of something volatile. A framed picture of your fiancé. I assumed that meant the engagement had already happened. The words landed softly, almost gently, but they detonated all the same. Lily's fork froze halfway to her mouth. That must have been later, she replied quickly, too quickly, her voice lifting at the end in a way that made it sound less like a correction and more like a plea. I didn't officially get engaged until after that rotation ended. Ethan's brow furrowed, not in anger but in confusion that was far more dangerous. I flew out there after I proposed, he said slowly, like someone replaying an old memory and noticing a skipped frame. That was before you finished the assignment. We took those beach photos the same week. Lily's posture stiffened, shoulders drawing back as if bracing against an invisible impact. No, she insisted, shaking her head with a small laugh that felt brittle. You're mixing up the trips. You visited twice. The engagement dinner was after I got home for good. Daniel did not interrupt, did not challenge her directly. He simply continued in that same even tone that had carried authority all afternoon. The photo was in uniform, he clarified. You were both dressed up. It looked recent. I remember because someone asked about it during a briefing and you seemed proud. The silence that followed was not polite this time. It was heavy, deliberate, stretching across the length of the table while the string lights hummed faintly above us. Even Noah had stopped swinging his legs. I kept my gaze lowered to my glass, resisting the instinct to watch Lily unravel in real time. I did not need to see it to feel it. Lily's composure began to fracture at the edges. I was proud, she snapped, the sweetness gone now, replaced by something sharp and defensive. That doesn't mean the timing was exactly how you remember it. It was a chaotic period. I was balancing so much. Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her with an expression I had never seen directed at her before. Not adoration, not easy agreement, but calculation. So we were engaged while you were still there, he said quietly, not accusing, just clarifying. Because that's how I remember it. She exhaled hard through her nose, fingers tightening around the stem of her wine glass. We were practically engaged, she amended, the adjustment subtle but telling. We had talked about it. The official announcement came later. Daniel nodded once as if accepting the revision, but the damage had already been done. The distinction between practically and officially felt flimsy in the open air. The timeline was no longer seamless. It had seams now visible and fraying. Patricia, who had rushed to Lily's defense all afternoon over far smaller slights, said nothing. She stared at the tablecloth, lips pressed thin as if silence were the only safe position left. That absence of intervention spoke louder than any argument could have. Lily's explanations grew more hurried the longer the quiet stretched. It wasn't like that, she insisted, though no one had specified what that was. I was focused on my career. I was under pressure. Everyone knew about Ethan. There was nothing inappropriate. No one had used the word inappropriate either. I remained still, hands folded lightly in my lap, posture straight but relaxed, offering no commentary and no encouragement. I had asked a question earlier and then stepped back. Everything unfolding now was of her own construction. I felt no triumph, no vindication, only a steady clarity as the narrative she had curated so carefully began to wobble under its own weight. Ethan's gaze did not leave her. I just want to understand the order of things, he said, his voice calm but stripped of its earlier warmth. So, another silence settled, thicker than the last. The glow of the string lights seemed harsher now, illuminating expressions that could no longer hide behind celebration. Lily opened her mouth as if to offer another clarification, then closed it, the certainty that had carried her through the day noticeably diminished. I said nothing further. I did not need to. The story was no longer mine to defend against. It was hers to maintain, and for the first time she was struggling to keep it intact. Lily tried to recover the evening the way she recovered everything else in her life, by smiling harder and speaking faster, by pretending that if she layered enough charm over the cracks no one would notice the fault lines underneath. She lifted her glass and suggested we toast to new beginnings, to family, to the baby, her voice bright again but stretched too tight, like fabric pulled past its limit. The words sounded rehearsed and the timing felt desperate. For a moment we all complied with the performance, glasses clinking softly under the string lights, but the earlier tension did not dissolve. It settled into the spaces between us, invisible and immovable. Ethan did not return to his previous ease. He sat slightly back in his chair now, shoulders squared but no longer angled toward Lily with automatic alignment. He watched her when she spoke, really watched her, as if measuring tone against memory. He did not accuse her of anything, did not raise his voice, did not create a scene. His silence was far more unsettling than anger would have been. It was the silence of someone replaying years in his mind, checking details he had never thought to question. Daniel remained composed, hands folded loosely near his plate, offering no additional commentary and no rescue. He had stated what he remembered and left it at that. There was no smugness in him, no satisfaction, only the steady neutrality of someone accustomed to facts carrying their own consequences. If Lily had expected him to soften the edges of his recollection, she had miscalculated. Across from me, Lily's confidence continued to erode in small, telling ways. Her laughter came half a second too late and ended too abruptly. Her jaw tightened each time Ethan asked for clarification, even when his questions were mild. She smoothed invisible wrinkles from her dress and adjusted her napkin repeatedly, movements that betrayed the internal scramble she was trying to conceal. The golden glow of the evening no longer framed her as effortlessly radiant. It highlighted strain. I kept my contributions minimal and deliberate. When spoken to directly, I answered calmly and without embellishment. I did not press the timeline again. I did not reference the photograph I had found or the contradictions she had already offered. I did not need to. The most powerful position at that table was not the one speaking the loudest but the one refusing to overplay a hand. Years in the Marines had taught me that sometimes the strongest move is restraint, letting an opponent exhaust themselves while you hold formation. Patricia remained unusually quiet. The woman who had once narrated Lily's achievements like scripture now stared at her wine glass as though it might offer guidance. She did not rush to clarify or correct. She did not chastise Ethan for asking reasonable questions. That silence marked a shift more profound than any raised voice could have. For the first time in our lives, Lily was standing without automatic reinforcement. The conversation limped forward, detouring into safer subjects like nursery paint colors and upcoming hospital schedules, but the earlier fracture lingered beneath every word. It had changed the geometry of the table. Lily was no longer the untouchable center around which admiration orbited unquestioned. She was a person whose story had been tested and found less seamless than advertised. As I sat there in my dress blues beneath the soft lights, I felt a quiet, steady satisfaction that had nothing to do with humiliation or revenge. I had not attacked her. I had not raised my voice or revealed anything that was not already true. I had simply refused to shrink and then asked a single measured question. The rest had unfolded on its own. For years I had been positioned as the cautionary tale, the intense older sister who chose the wrong path while Lily chose the right one. Tonight, without theatrics and without cruelty, that narrative had cracked. Not shattered, not destroyed, but cracked enough that everyone at the table could see through it. I did not need applause. I did not need an apology. The emotional payoff was quieter than that. It was the realization that the power dynamic had shifted, not because I overpowered her, but because I stopped participating in the version of myself she required to stay elevated. Under the string lights, with the evening air cool against my uniform collar, I understood that Lily's strength had always depended on controlling the story. And for the first time she no longer fully controlled it. I stepped away from the table once the plates had been cleared, needing the quiet of the garden again, and this time the air felt different, less suffocating, as if something heavy had already broken and settled. The string lights behind me cast long shadows across the lawn, and I could hear the muted rhythm of conversation continuing without me. I stood near the fountain with my hands loosely clasped behind my back, posture still instinctively straight even though no one was inspecting me. I heard my mother's footsteps before she spoke. Patricia had always moved with purpose, heels clicking like punctuation marks, but now her approach was slower, uncertain. She stopped a few feet away, and for a moment neither of us said anything. I did not turn immediately. I let her choose her words. "Madison," she began, and her voice lacked its usual polish. I faced her then, and for the first time that day she did not look composed. The lines around her eyes seemed deeper in the low light, her expression stripped of performance. "I owe you something," she said quietly. I did not respond, but I held her gaze steadily, giving her space without rescuing her from it. "We never knew how to celebrate what you chose," she admitted after a pause. "The military, the deployments, the risks scared me more than I ever said out loud. Every time you left, I was waiting for a phone call I prayed would never come. It was easier to focus on Lily because her life made sense to me. School, engagement, marriage, baby. I understood those milestones. I knew how to throw parties for them." There was no defensiveness in her tone now, only something raw and unguarded. "We didn't ignore you because we weren't proud," she continued. "We ignored parts of it because we didn't know how to hold it. Your career felt distant and dangerous and complicated. Lily's felt safe." The words settled into me slowly. For years I had interpreted their favoritism as a verdict on my worth, proof that I had chosen incorrectly, that I was somehow less complete. Hearing her frame it as confusion rather than condemnation did not erase the past, but it shifted its outline. "When you wore that uniform today," she said, glancing briefly at the medals on my chest before meeting my eyes again, "I realized something. I have spent so much time worrying about whether you would ever have the life I pictured for you that I never stopped to recognize the life you actually built. And it is extraordinary, Madison. It just isn't one I understood." Her voice trembled slightly on the last word, and that tremor affected me more than any dramatic apology would have. I felt the old ache rise in my throat, the one I used to swallow down at graduations and holidays when my accomplishments were mentioned as side notes. I did not want to weaponize this moment by demanding a catalogue of wrongs. I did not need a theatrical apology delivered under string lights. I just needed recognition. "I'm not Lily," I said evenly, though my voice was softer than before. "I was never going to be. And I don't regret that." She nodded quickly, almost urgently. "I see that now," she replied. "I see you now." The simplicity of it struck deeper than I expected. Not "I'm sorry for everything." Not "I'll fix this tomorrow." Just "I see you." For someone who had spent years feeling like a supporting character in her own family, that acknowledgement carried weight. We stood there in silence for a few seconds, the fountain trickling beside us, the distant murmur of voices drifting through the warm night air. She reached out hesitantly as if unsure whether I would accept it, and placed her hand over mine. The gesture was small, not dramatic, but it was intentional. I did not demand that she choose sides or condemn Lily. I did not list grievances or reopen old competitions. I simply let her hand remain there and allowed the moment to exist without armor. Reconciliation did not arrive like fireworks or a sweeping declaration. It began quietly in the space where misunderstanding had once lived. For the first time in a long time, I did not feel like the difficult daughter or the unfinished story. I felt seen, not as contrast to my sister, not as the cautionary tale, but as myself. And that, more than any public vindication, was enough to shift something permanent between us. When my mother and I walked back toward the table, nothing looked dramatically different. The string lights still glowed, the plates were being cleared, the night air still carried the scent of cut grass and expensive candles, yet the atmosphere had shifted in a way that was impossible to miss. Earlier in the day the whispers had followed me, brushing against my back like static, curious and faintly judgmental. But now the glances moved in a different direction. Conversations lowered when Lily spoke, not out of admiration but out of recalibration, as if everyone present was quietly adjusting the version of her they had accepted without question a few hours earlier. Lily continued smiling, continued playing the gracious hostess, but the ease was gone. It was subtle, visible only if you knew her well enough to recognize the difference between genuine confidence and effort. Her laughter rang a little too sharp. Her gestures were a fraction too controlled. She was still beautiful, still poised, still pregnant and glowing under the lights, but the untouchable aura had thinned. The golden child was no longer suspended above scrutiny. Ethan stood slightly apart from her now, not in open conflict, not visibly upset, but distant in a way that felt new. He listened more than he spoke, his eyes thoughtful, occasionally drifting toward Lily with a look I could not fully decipher. It was not anger. It was assessment. The kind that lingers long after a dinner ends. When she reached for his hand at one point, he took it automatically, yet his attention did not fully return to her. The effortless alignment they had displayed earlier in the day had loosened. Daniel approached me as the evening began to wind down, his posture relaxed but deliberate. "I appreciated how you handled that," he said quietly so that only I could hear. "You didn't escalate. You didn't humiliate anyone. You just asked the right question." I gave a small nod, aware that in another life, another setting, restraint like that might have been expected without comment. Tonight it felt like acknowledgement. "I wasn't trying to expose anyone," I replied. "I was just clarifying." He studied me for a moment with something that resembled respect rather than sympathy. "That's rarer than you think," he said. Before I could respond, Noah appeared at my side again, his small hand clutching something bright and slightly crumpled. "I have something for you," he announced with solemn importance. He peeled a butterfly sticker from its backing, the kind meant for reward charts or school notebooks, and looked up at my sleeve. "You look strong," he said matter-of-factly, "but butterflies are strong too. They just don't look like it at first." For a split second I hesitated, aware of the contrast between polished metals and a neon butterfly, between military precision and childlike spontaneity. Then I crouched slightly to meet his height and extended my arm. He pressed the sticker carefully onto the dark blue fabric near my elbow, smoothing it down with exaggerated concentration. There was nothing mocking in the gesture, no hidden meaning, just simple honesty offered without agenda. Around us, adults navigated tension with careful phrasing and selective memory, but an 8-year-old had reduced the entire evening to something uncomplicated. Strength did not always need to be hard-edged. Truth did not always need to be loud. I thanked him sincerely, and he grinned as if he had just awarded a medal of his own. When I straightened again, I caught a few curious looks from the remaining guests, their expressions uncertain about how to interpret the bright sticker against my formal uniform. Earlier that day I might have felt self-conscious, worried about disrupting the image of discipline and control. Now I felt nothing but clarity. The uniform was not armor tonight. It was simply part of me, just as much as the quiet restraint I had chosen and the small butterfly now clinging to my sleeve. I stood there beneath the fading lights, shoulders back, not out of defense but out of habit, and realized that I no longer felt like a prop in someone else's celebration. The narrative had shifted, not because I demanded attention but because I refused to shrink. The whispers had moved on. The focus had widened. And for the first time in that carefully curated backyard, I was not bracing for impact. I was simply present, not armored, not competing, not performing intensity to survive comparison. Just myself, metals polished, butterfly bright, standing tall without apology. There was no explosion, no shattered glass, no raised voices echoing into the Carolina night. The evening dissolved the way it had begun, with polite goodbyes and careful smiles, plates stacked, chairs folded, string lights dimmed one section at a time. If someone had arrived at the very end, they would have seen nothing more than a successful baby shower followed by an intimate family dinner. The damage, if that is what it could be called, existed entirely in what had been revealed, not in what had been declared. I did not confront Lily publicly. I did not list evidence or demand confession. I asked a question about timing and then I allowed the truth to breathe on its own. Watching her try to reassemble the narrative without losing composure was enough. The perfection she curated had not collapsed dramatically. It had cracked just enough for those paying attention to see that it was constructed, not divine. When I hugged my mother goodbye, she held me a second longer than usual. There was no grand speech this time, no repetition of earlier admissions, just a quiet squeeze that felt intentional. She looked at me not as the daughter who chose the complicated path, not as the cautionary contrast to Lily's milestones, but as someone whose strength she was finally willing to acknowledge without qualification. That shift did not erase years of imbalance, but it marked a turning point. For the first time, I was not being measured against my sister in her eyes. I was being measured against myself. Daniel walked Noah to the car before returning to shake my hand. The gesture was formal at first, then relaxed. "If you ever want to grab coffee and compare notes about civilian transition," he said lightly, "let me know." There was no rescue in his tone, no implication that I needed saving, only possibility offered without pressure. I appreciated that more than any flirtation. I did not need him to validate me, and he did not try to. The respect between us stood on its own. Across the driveway, Lily stood beside Ethan, her hand looped through his arm. She still looked polished, still beautiful, but the certainty that had wrapped around her all afternoon was thinner now. Ethan's posture was attentive but no longer blindly aligned. He listened more carefully when she spoke. He studied her in ways he had not before. The shift was quiet, almost imperceptible yet undeniable. Her image had not been destroyed, but it had been humanized, and that alone changed the balance of power she had relied on for years. As I walked to my car, the butterfly sticker caught my eye under the soft glow of the porch light. It looked absurd against the sharp lines of my dress blues, bright and childlike against disciplined symmetry. Earlier in my life I might have peeled it off to preserve the image. Tonight I left it there. Strength did not have to be severe to be real. Honesty did not require volume to have impact. I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, the quiet settling around me like a deep breath after a long march. I did not feel victorious over Lily. I did not feel the thrill of defeating an opponent. What I felt was something steadier and far more valuable. I felt free. Free from the need to prove that my path was equal to hers. Free from shrinking to keep peace. Free from playing the role of the intense older sister whose life existed as a contrast device in someone else's story. I had not screamed. I had not attacked. I had not exposed secrets recklessly. I had simply refused to accept the part assigned to me. The engine started smoothly, and as I drove out of Carmel Heights, past the trimmed hedges and guarded gates, I realized that the real shift had not happened at the dinner table. It had happened the moment I chose not to shrink when asked. The moment I decided that my existence did not need to be softened for someone else's comfort. Sometimes revenge is not loud. It is not theatrical. It does not require humiliation or destruction. Sometimes it is as simple as standing still when someone expects you to step back, asking one honest question and letting the truth do the rest. I did not leave as the villain of Lily's celebration, and I did not leave as her shadow. I left steady, unapologetic, and finally untethered from comparison.